Okay, so the title of my presentation this morning is circular economy, and then I kind of divided into three separate parts: zero waste, regeneration, and long-term use. And those are kind of three components of what circular economies entail. The idea is to eventually approach the ideal or the utopia of zero waste. And that's the idea that everything that we use can be recycled, regenerated. We're going to talk about, the letter R is an important one. Yeah, but all of the different R's that are tied up in circularity and circular economies. But then also how, this economic model isn't just about making sure that we take our pop cans and plastic bottles so that they can be recycled. It goes beyond that. We're talking about regeneration of the natural systems that we've come to depend on. One of the things in a linear economic model, which is what we have today, which is essentially where raw materials are mined, they're manufactured, they're used for usually a very short time by consumers, and then they eventually are thrown into the trash, end up in a landfill somewhere, or burned. And that entails that new consumption requires new extraction. And as we know around the world, extraction of raw materials, causes an enormous amount of environmental damage. So by switching to an economy or an economic model where materials circulate as long as physically possible, the idea is that we reduce demand for any sort of extraction, just helping natural systems to regenerate, helping natural healthy ecosystems to capture more carbon from the atmosphere, hopefully help us in our long-term struggle against global climate change. And then all of that depends on a third kind of part or component of the circular economy. And that's more of I would say perhaps a cultural change or a mindset change, which is the idea that, the things that we purchase, first of all, we need to have limits to our consumption, which is something that most economists, aren't very, don't talk about very nicely. The idea is not to limit things, but to use as much as possible. But the idea is that, yeah, if we if we change to a circular economic model, then we need to have items that, one, last a long time, that we challenge this idea of planned obsolescence, which is very common, which is essentially where companies make cheap, shoddily made products so that we have to purchase a new one, in a couple years, couple months. I think the average amount of time that people use a cell phone nowadays is somewhere around 17 months. And partly because we always want the new thing, but also because they're not very well made. And after a year and a half or so of use, they tend to break down. And replacing a part or getting it fixed is often more expensive than actually purchasing a new one. So the idea is to change this model. We need to focus on long-term use of materials. So this is a typical kind of model of what how we can organize and design our economic models. If you look at the line, this is generally what happens. So we have an energy and material input. So for example, let's take the computer that I'm using right now. Most computers use over 40 or 50 different raw materials, so elements that are on like the periodic table. And one of the things that's unique about technology is that they use all of these rare earth metals, cobalt and palladium and all these. I'm not a chemist or a geoscientist, but there's dozens of different raw materials that go into most technologies, and with every type of material, whether it be the cereal that we had this morning. Obviously, there's probably some sort of grain in that, corn or wheat, but then all of the petroleum that was involved in that, all of the other inputs that are involved. So, the economic process always begins with energy and material inputs from the natural world. Then it goes through a production process, manufacturing. The material is then distributed on our global scale. Generally what happens is, the average product will move from where it is sourced to where it is produced to where it is eventually sold and used, several thousand kilometers. Then there's a use, generally, like I said, in our current economic model, very, very short-term use. I guess the worst case scenario is the single-use plastics that are very common. So, example, you go to the grocery store and they give you a plastic bag that you use for maybe 10 minutes when you carry it from the store to your home, and then it goes straight in the trash. So in that case, that the actual usage of the material is sometimes 5 to 10 minutes. Then it is disposed, and it eventually ends up as wastes, emissions, leakages, and other all sorts of serious environmental and public health problems. This line is basically how our global economic system works. Circular economy, seeks to try and create, these here. I don't know if you can see my, these little loops, right? To try and create more of a circular process. So, for example, when we get to the disposal, same thing. We need an energy and material input. We need to produce something. We need it to be distributed. We need to use it. And then before going to disposal, we can use this one here, which is reuse. We can reuse the product instead of simply throwing it away. We can remanufacture or refurbish it. So, for example, going back to the computer that I use, over the last 10 years, I've made a priority to only purchase refurbished or electronics. That's my own, I suppose, kind of line about how I can try to limit demand for all of these raw earth materials. So a lot of times when you're searching for a new computer online or at a store, you'll see a product that means it's been refurbished, which means that you can send it back to the manufacturer or a fix-up store. They might change the battery, might change some other things or whatever, but eventually try and keep it in use, have it remanufactured. The other one is longer use, intensifying use, and dematerialization. This is the idea of trying to keep materials in use as long as possible. And the idea is to avoid ending up here, where we dispose things and it ends up as wastes, emissions, carbon emissions, leakages, etc. When materials end up in landfills, it doesn't just take up space. All of those things eventually start to break down. Landfill gas is mostly made up of methane, which is one of the most potent greenhouse gases. Perhaps even worse than carbon dioxide in several instances. Of course, people who live near landfills and dumps and things like that, there's all these issues, public health problems. And then, when things end up there, they're not recoverable. Our landfills are not exactly being scoured over by people in many cases. And so what happens is that, there's demand for more energy and material input. So circularity is about trying to add as many loops as possible within this linear model, right? Here's a quick, before we get into why circularity is important, I think it's important to look at what's wrong with this line. If we don't add in all of these little loops about reuse, remanufacturing, recycling, all of these re's we're going to talk about, longer use, intensifying use, what is happening if we, with this linear model? First of all, and perhaps I think the most important issue is that nature is ignored. Herman Daly is an economist. He was one of the founders of ecological economics. And if you look at this little diagram here on the left, he said one of the biggest problems within the world of economics is that economists, whether you be a socialist economist, a capitalist economist, a neoliberal economist, communist economist, doesn't matter. Economists generally think that this human economy exists kind of in a sphere all by itself. That the ideas of inputs and transformations and delivering products to consumers exist kind of within a vacuum, within this little bubble. And he said, no, of course it doesn't. What we need to know is that the human economy always exists within a larger system, which is the Earth system. There's a lot of kind of like sci-fi movies that talk about mining asteroids and how humanity can find new inputs from outer space, but that's still a pipe dream, right? We're not doing that. So everything that we use, all of the materials that we require, and all of the, where all of these materials and all of the consumer items we use, where they eventually end up, depends on this larger Earth system. So the Earth system, what does it give? Well, it gives all of the raw material inputs, everything from the soil that we require for the food we grow to the raw earth elements that we require to be able to, have this online class this morning. And then at the end of the human economy is the sinks. So we need to understand that economy happens within a larger Earth system. Herman Daly said that mainstream economics, which only focuses on the circular flow of money between households and businesses, completely omits the natural world. And that's psychotic. I mean, we have to understand that we live on one of the terms that people use is spaceship Earth. We share this home. There are limited amount of resources, limited amount of materials. There's also limits to how much waste we can create. And the most obvious of that is, there's only so much fossil fuels we can burn before we start to put too much, greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And now we're starting to see what happens when we do that. So in reality, the economy is not an isolated system. It is, as it is treated in mainstream economics, but a subsystem of the biosphere. That's one problem. If economics doesn't take into account this very real problem, this very real reality of belonging to the earth, then economics is flawed, right? Secondly, one of the main problems with this linear model of economics is that it's completely within the last 200 years, this intensification of economics, the globalization of economics, the compounded growth of our economic system has been completely dependent on fossil fuels. So approximately 84% of the world's energy consumption today are met from fossil fuels. Oil accounts for 33%, gas and coal 24 and 27%. And the reality is, one, that is coming to an end. Those materials are not infinite; they're finite. And sooner or later, every year they get harder and harder to extract because all of the oil, all of the coal, all of the natural gas that we've been using was relatively shallow. We've already used up all of those easy to access deposits. I heard one podcast this week where a guy said that, in the past, from 1850 until 1970, to extract fossil fuels, all we had to do was basically put a straw in the ground and things would bubble up because, there was a lot of very shallow, relatively easy to access fossil fuels. Those are gone. And in 2008, when the global economic crisis happened, we probably would have entered into a global collapse of sorts had it not been for a new technology, which is fracking, which is essentially where you have this material which is able to essentially crack, this deep embedded rocks in order to access the oil that is underneath that. We're quickly using that up as well. So what happens when fossil fuels are no longer available is that this linear model of economic growth is going to collapse, and that's something I think we desperately need to take into consideration. And though there is lots of investment in solar energy and wind and other renewables, it's important to mention that also every year the amount of fossil fuels that we extract and burn continues to increase. So we're not exactly making much headway there. Thirdly, another problem that's all tied into this linear global economic model is that we're addicted to growth. And here's an interesting concept. We tend to think when we hear statistics about when economists talk about, oh, it's great, our global economy is growing 3.56% this year. And there's always kind of like this gold standard that we need to grow the global economy at least 3% each year. But it's basic math. If you grow a certain percent each year, then the compound, so for example, if we grow 3% each year, that does not mean that in 33 years we'll have grown 99%. No, because each year it's a compound growth. So 3%, and then the next year another 3%, but on top of that. So here's a statistic. This is basic math. If the global economy continues to grow at 3% per year, we will consume as much energy and materials in the next 30 years as we did cumulatively in the last 10,000 years. I think that should wake us up. When we go back to this reality that the economy exists within a larger subsystem, can we really continue to advocate for a, you know, a 3% growth per year, knowing that we're going to have to, you know, the next 30 years, the next 3 decades, we're going to need to extract as much energy and as much materials as, you know, the last 10,000 years. So however many generations of that. Edward Abbey is one of the famous kind of early ecologists or environmentalists. And he said, look, let's be honest, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. You know, anywhere in nature, when some subsystem of the natural world grows without stopping, it's seen as a problem. It's seen as a cancer. It's seen as something that needs some sort of outside intervention to stop that growth. And the global human economy has turned into that. We need to rethink the idea of growth. And then lastly, I would say another problem that we're facing today is that I think now some of the obvious and evident problems of the linear global economic model are obvious. Like, people are starting to wake up to the fact that, look, we're going to run out of fossil fuels. This is a problem. Global climate change is causing havoc around the world. People are starting to wake up to that. But instead of like rethinking some of the foundational myths, which is, for example, the idea of unlimited economic growth, or simply, instead of rethinking that, we just want to kind of simple tweaks to the system. So, for example, one of the ones that I find interesting is kind of an idea of eco-modernism. And it's an idea that's based on the fact that, it starts with the assumption that the modern world, the modern post-industrial, post-capitalist world, digitalized, consumer-driven, is good, and we want to continue that, and we can't imagine a world where that does not continue. So the idea of eco-modernism is a lot of kind of focused on, how we can continue this, but hopefully try to limit some of the economic or some of the ecological disasters that are occurring. And the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, which is interesting, you can find it online, is basically about, we need to corral people into cities, which is already happening. We have over half of our world population now lives in urban areas, but the idea is even more. We need to have 90 to 95% of people in hugely concentrated urban areas. Around these cities, we need to have intensively farmed areas. A lot of times they're talking about switching agriculture to laboratories. And the idea is that, obviously rely on enormous amounts of solar and wind energy and continue this great leap forward, but now trying to limit our damage to the natural world. You see a lot of that in the United States and other parts of the world that talk about the Green New Deal, where we're not trying to change anything fundamentally, but what we really want to do is just kind of, continue the status quo of consumption, of linear economic models, but let's just change to solar panels and wind energy and electric vehicles, and everything else will be fine. That's kind of I would say, a naive hope. Another thing is another kind of naive hope, I think, is that we're going to find an unlimited supply of renewable, clean energy. This is kind of tied in with the next one: belief in innovation and technological salvation. The idea is like, we might have been pretty close to global economic collapse in 2008, but the engineers and the scientists found out about fracking, and they kind of saved us, for the short term. And so there's all this kind of hope that all we have to do is figure out how to really improve solar panels, solar energy. Maybe we'll figure out how to do nuclear fusion someday so that we can have an unlimited supply of energy, and everything else will be fine. That I think is also naive, and it's trying to I think escape some of the fundamental issues of the problems. And then also there's this idea of that, we can continue to grow. We just have to decouple our economic growth from the use of resources and dependence on energy. So the idea we can continue to grow, but not need more resources. Of course, when we go back to this linear economic model, we see that everything begins right here with energy and material inputs. And so the idea is that we can continue to grow, but we won't have, more energy needs. And again, I think that's kind of naive. A lot of the big folks in the tech world, I think, have started to pin a lot of their hopes on this idea of the metaverse, the idea of artificial intelligence kind of driving economic growth, where we end up spending money and growing the economy, but within digitalized worlds instead of the real resource-rich world. I guess my question there would be whether we really want to live completely immersed in digital metaverses, or if we do believe that it's living in this biophysical world which we have inherited is worthwhile. I'll leave each one of you all to think about that. But yeah, so yeah, given all of these kind of naive ideas that we can tweak the idea of any sort of Green New Deal, where we might miraculously discover an abundant source of renewable energy. I think, and lots of ecological economists think, that would be the worst thing for the natural world and for our own well-being. Because if we do have unlimited energy, that's going to mean more demand for natural resources, more waste that eventually ends up in the world. And I wanted to start with this kind of criticizing this economic model, because unfortunately, lots of big companies, big corporations around the world, they know that consumers in general are worried about the environment, and the idea of circular economy is kind of being used. There's a term that you've probably heard called greenwashing, where some company, they might recycle 5% of their post-manufacture waste, and they'll say, oh, we're embracing a circular economic model. Some other company might claim that they're implementing some sort of I don't know, other recycling initiative or some sort, where they're really not changing anything, but they're claiming to be a circular economic model. And what I'm arguing is that true circular economy, and we're going to look at some examples, starts with questioning the fundamental problems with our linear economic system. It's going to be focused on degrowth, limiting growth, and changing, the fundamental consumer ethos of purchasing, using, and discarding as quickly as possible. Again, so lastly, this last part is that our main predicament isn't that we need to switch to renewable energies. It's not that we just need to take out, try and figure out a way to capture some of the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's not that we simply need to make some sort of tweak to the system. It's that we have reached what is ecological overshoot. Our economy, our economic model has forgotten that we exist within the larger Earth system. And then so that the amount of materials and the amount of energy that we use every year has put us into overshoot. Overshoot is a phenomenon which occurs when the human demands made on the natural system in which we live exceeds its regenerative capacity. So in other words, we're extracting materials faster than the Earth can replenish them. We are putting waste into the Earth system faster than the Earth can break that down. Scientists have talked a lot recently about Earth Overshoot Day, which is the day of the year where we have kind of used up more materials and more energy than what the Earth can produce us. And so if you look at this graph here, I hope you can see it. Back in 1971, the Earth Overshoot Day occurred kind of like the end of December, almost the last day. So we're almost using all of the materials and all the energy that was available to us for that year, almost within a year, right? Obviously, before 1971, back, before this explosion of economic growth, people weren't using, even nearly the amount of materials and energy that was needed. But as you can see, this graph is going down, so that by 2023, Earth Overshoot Day is occurring in July. So essentially what that means is that the amount of materials, all sorts of physical materials, and the amount of energy we need for our economic system, we are as a global system, we are using the amount of materials and energy of 1.7 Earths. The problem, of course, is that we don't have 1.7 Earths. We have one. So we are drawing down our capital. We're drawing down, the amount of materials that we have. And what does that cause? Well, it's causing the Earth to degrade. If we think about future generations, we're going to bequeath to our children and our grandchildren a world that does not have the same amount of materials and energy inputs needed to sustain life. So how does a circular economy respond to this kind of grim reality, this grim economic reality? So first of all, here's a quick definition. The circular economy is a model of production and consumption. That's important. It's not just about how to produce things differently. It's also it also challenges some of the fundamental ideas about consumption, right? So it's the circular economy applies to both companies, corporations, businesses, but also to individuals, collectives of consumers, towns, etc. Right? So the circular economy is a model of production and consumption, which involves sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, recycling existing materials and products as long as possible. In this way, the life cycle of products is extended, waste is radically reduced, and the demand for new resource extraction is also reduced. In its most radical conception, the circular economy has to exist with an economic logic of degrowth. We're going to try and break down this definition a little bit farther, but I think this idea right here of degrowth is fundamental, right? If we're going to be sharing products, for example, then that means that not every person is going to purchase. Here's an example. The other day, with some of our neighbors, I had an old wheelbarrow that we used for carting our manure to one part of the farm to the other one, and it broke down. It was probably about 15 years old. And so me and three other neighbors, they also did not have a wheelbarrow. And so we decided to each pitch in about $15 each, and we purchased a new wheelbarrow. I don't use a wheelbarrow every day, neither do they. So the idea is that let's purchase one and we'll share it, right? So between four families, we share a wheelbarrow now. And that is fundamentally different than each one of us purchasing a wheelbarrow. In terms of modern day economics, that was wasteful. It would have been better for each family to have purchased a wheelbarrow, because that means more economic, more spending, more resource extraction, more economic activity. In a circular economy, the idea is that we share, right? So the more that you share, the less that you purchase. The more that you reuse items, the less that you have to purchase them. The more that items are repaired or refurbished or recycled means that they do not have to, that you're essentially purchasing less. Because of that, the idea of the circular economy has to exist within a larger framework of degrowth, right? What is degrowth? Degrowth is an economic design centered around reducing levels of production and consumption within an economy in order to conserve natural resources and minimize environmental damage. Now, if any politician today were to announce that their economic policy was going to be focused on degrowing the economy instead of growing it, they would essentially be committing, political suicide, I think, unfortunately. However, there are some countries and some politicians that have very recently started to use, this word, degrowth. Perhaps one of the most famous ones is Emmanuel Macron from France. The president of France recently talked about the need to degrow. But in general, politicians are aimed at growing the economy. That's the main growth. That's one of the things that people are elected on, right? But the idea is that no, degrowth needs to happen. It needs to happen in order to conserve the very limited amount of natural resources, and to go back to an economic model where we're not consuming more materials and more energy than what the earth has to offer. That's essential, right? And the other thing that I think is important about degrowth is that it's also focused on changing, the indexes or the parameters that we use to measure, what is healthy. So, for example, today we talk about GDP, growth domestic product or growth world product. The more that an economy grows, the more that it's supposedly healthy. And the idea is that no, let's talk about other things. Just because every person, every family, every household is purchasing, a wheelbarrow doesn't mean that they're happier. In some senses, sharing a wheelbarrow with your neighbors and with your friends might create more of a sense of a community. And so the idea is that we need new indexes, new measurements in order to really gauge what is healthy for a society and what makes a society happy, fulfilled. And so there's all these there's the Gini index, the growth what is it called? Something about happiness, the happiness index, the gross national well-being. There's all these kind of alternative ideas that you can degrow and still supply communities or societies with what they need for, subsistence, but then also allow people to look. If you work less, you might have more time for your hobbies, more time for your family, more time for your children, more time for community involvement, and all of these things are things that we should look about. Some of the principles of degrowth are around sustainability, circularity, cooperation, useful production. This is an important one because I think a lot of the economic production that a lot of people engage in today is essentially for products that are really not that useful. Sharing, localized production. We talked about local economy in a past class. A better work-life balance, relational goods, and then this one, the joie de vivre. That there is something more important than just making money, right? So what are some of the principles of the circular economy? If these are the principles of degrowth, what are some of the principles of circular economy? And they generally talk about three generalized principles. One, we need to eliminate waste and pollution. Okay, this is an ideal. If any of you are, know anything about physics, you probably know that there's a thing called the second law of thermodynamics, which essentially means that things are going to degrade, right? And that's bound to happen, So no matter any type of economic use, things are eventually going to degrade and need to be thrown away. But that doesn't mean that has to happen, with like the example of the plastic bag, right? It doesn't mean that we only use it for 10 minutes and throw it away. It means that we can design systems where we can try to use things for as long as possible. So, for example, the wheelbarrow. When we went and looked for the wheelbarrow we were going to buy yesterday morning, we looked for one that was made out of, durable materials. We also looked for one that we thought we could fix if it broke down, if it needed to be fixed. Could we find a new wheel? Could we weld some parts if it needed to be welded? So yeah, the idea of how to find materials, consumer goods, create economic spaces for them to be repaired and refurbished as long as possible. And then when they do eventually degrade, so eventually, if we use our wheelbarrow for 20, 30, 40 years, there's going to come a time when it eventually breaks down. It doesn't matter how careful you are or how well built it is, things do break down. So what happens with those materials at the end? Can we still recycle some of the metals in there into other products? Can we reuse that? So maybe the wheel is still good. How can we reuse the wheel for some other use on our farm? So yeah, eliminate waste and pollution is an ideal. There's always going to be some sort of waste, but how can we try to design an economic system that reduces that as much as possible? Secondly, a second principle is we need to circulate products and materials at their highest value. And that's important. The highest value part, one of the problems with, for example, cheap plastics, really, really thin plastics, is that they're essentially valueless. And within the last 10 years, it's become essentially economically impossible to recycle plastic. So, for example, the United States used to ship boatloads of cheap plastics to China, to Indonesia, and other parts for them to recycle. And eventually, when it lost its value, when it was so cheap that there was no economic incentive to recycle that, all of that plastic ended up in landfills in China. And so the idea is to create products where we can circulate it at its highest possible value. And lastly, we need to regenerate nature. When we do focus on a degrowth model where we are extracting less materials, putting less waste into the system, how can we also try and create a world where we regenerate nature? Another interesting aspect of the circular economy is that there is this idea of the 10 R's. I don't know about you all, but when I was in grade school, we always talked about 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recycle. That was kind of like the environmental ethic, right? Reduce the amount of materials you use, reuse as much as possible, and then recycle. But the circular economy talks about 10 different R's. So one, recover. Recover materials. There's a lot of people that are saying that the new mining that might happen in the world might not be mining for raw resources, but maybe we should open up our landfills there is an enormous amount of metals and copper and plastics and all these other things that are just sitting there. How can we recover these materials that we've essentially wasted, by this linear economic model, by short-term use of products? How can we recover those to remanufacture? Recycle, of course, repurpose. So, for example, the idea of an old wheelbarrow. The old wheelbarrow that I had, I didn't throw it into the trash. I didn't send it to the local landfill. My wife, who likes to grow plants, turned it into a planter. So we have that sitting in front of our house now with a bunch of flowers in it, right? Remanufacture, refurbish, repair, reuse. That's another one. Reduce. That's one that's important. Rethink. And then the one that's most important to me is the one I've highlighted here in red: refuse. And that's one I think is extremely essential, and perhaps one of the most fundamental aspects of circular economy is that, as communities, as individuals, we need to be able to refuse certain things, right? So refuse cheap consumer products that we're not going to use, refuse the single-use plastics. And refuse doesn't just occur on a consumer level. I think there probably is a political mandate, that politicians can refuse certain types of economic production that simply aren't useful and that cause more harm than good. So we need to be able to refuse certain aspects of the linear economic model which simply do not work. And then also there's an extremely important part of embracing the idea of willingly and collectively refusing economic growth. That, I think, is the same response to our predicament. We need to learn to degrow, find happiness and meaning in things outside of consumption, and share, what this world produces. Share it with people who are more than just us, right? So here are a few examples. What does circular economy look like? Where it's not just greenwashing, where it's not just some major transnational corporation trying to tell us that they're really good stewards of the environment when they're really not doing anything. What is a true example of circular economy? There's a company called Loop. They are based out of somewhere in the European Union, I forget exactly, but they're a company that is helping large brands, large transnational corporations, to shift to reusable packaging. And so one of the things that, a lot of these, what I think is kind of like greenwashing of circularity, is when companies claim that they're using recycled packaging, or supposedly biodegradable packaging. The idea is that simply you're continuing to use materials one more time before they eventually get thrown away. And the idea is that Loop is saying, look, let's try and circulate items at their highest possible value for as much as possible. And the idea is that when you go to the store with Loop, the consumers are going to pay a refundable deposit for each package, use the products, and then instead of simply throwing them into the trash can, and instead of simply throwing them into the recycle bin, the idea is to return them to a Loop tote. The reusable packaging is then sent back to the manufacturer, who cleans it, refills it, and it's used again. When you think about it, this is not a radical idea. This is what people always used to do. So, for example, my grandmother was raised on a dairy farm, and they had local dairy production. They would take the milk, once a day, and go and deliver it to all the different neighbors in glass jugs. That when they left one glass jug of milk, and the neighbors would give them another glass of milk, a different glass jug that was empty. So this way, you're essentially returning the bottle in which it was produced, so that you're not having to, throw away, reproduce new items. But we've gotten so far away from that, right? We've gotten so far away from that. And what's replaced it, the supposedly environmental example of that is, well, we use recyclable packaging. Well, it'd be much better, instead of trying to recycle, which does, recycling does take an enormous amount of energy as well, just reuse the product. So this company Loop is working with, major brands like Cascade and Ariel, Pantene, Pro V, Tide cleaners, Crest toothpaste, all of these well-known brands. And the idea is that there's a major shift in consumer mentality. It's not just use and throw away. It's like, okay, now I have a responsibility to return this to the company, and the company has a shared responsibility as well. That's why we said the circular economy is a model of production and consumption. It requires changes on both sides of of the economic picture, right? Here's another example. There is a company based out of Denmark, I think it is, that's producing a product that they call chips board. And it's basically creating plywood, a type of MDF or medium density fiber board. So basically all of, what we use inside our homes, kind of like instead of drywall, plywoods and other types of kind of manufactured wood. But instead of depending on wood from trees that are cut down and processed, they're making it from potato peels, right? So this company is actually working with Lay's potato chips, one of the bigger companies producing snacks, and all of these potato peels, which probably were thrown away or maybe composted, but most likely thrown away, are being used. A waste product, an otherwise waste product, are being used to create a durable, low energy input and product that obviously reduces demand on our forests and other types of wood products. So this is an example of how to develop a product, reducing environmental impacts using readily disposable materials that otherwise would have been waste. And so going back to what Dr. Velson said at the beginning, nothing, in the natural world, nothing is wasted, everything is transformed. How can the circular economy respond to that reality, right? So potato peels, are eventually wasted, but we can transform them. How can we kind of learn from nature and develop economic models that try to put into practice this idea of transforming everything? Another space within our global economy that I think deserves a lot of attention is the construction industry. There's a lot of statistics about how much greenhouse gases are created by cement production and other things. But one of the things that's interesting to me is that the construction industry is responsible for approximately half of all resource extraction on a global scale. So all of the cement, all of the wood, all of the synthetic materials, all of the copper for electricity, all of the plastics and metals for plumbing. It's an enormous amount of materials. All of the steel used for these skyscrapers we're building. The construction industry has an enormous environmental footprint. So how can we change that? And one model that's existed for several years is called the Earth ships. I would encourage you to look those up on Google. They're fascinating. They're beautiful. You look at them and they're extremely interesting. The idea is that they use as much recycled materials as possible. Earth ships are famous for building their walls out of recycled tires. As you can see in this picture here, they also use lots and lots of bottles, old glass bottles that would otherwise spend millions of years decomposing. And then there are passive solar, which means they are built in such a way where they capture the energy from the sun to reduce heating and cooling requirements. And they're also built from local materials, so earth, mud, other products that you can find locally without needing to extract materials from far away. So earth ships, I think, are an example that have existed for 30, 40 years, but are a great example of how we can create circularity into our built environment. And then lastly, here's one that we don't usually think about, is that small scale subsistence farms. I think that's a perfect example of circularity. If you look at the large industrial farming kind of methods, it's the exact opposite. They require huge amounts of one-time, one-use inputs in the forms of fossil fuels. Most large industrial farms throw an enormous amount of nitrogen fertilizer onto the soil. It gives a quick boost of fertility to the plants, but then that fertility is lost. Nitrous oxide then raises up from the soil, and nitrous oxide is another extremely harmful greenhouse gas. And then the products usually degrade the natural systems such as soil and whatnot. And then the products are shipped worldwide, causing another enormous amount of emissions and environmental impact. Small scale subsistence farms, on the other hand, are the perfect example of everything being transformed. Small scale farmers around the world generally raise livestock. I always tell the example in the northern highlands of Guatemala, where I used to live. Almost every farmer had a huge flock of sheep. But one of the things I noticed when I was there is that they hardly ever ate the sheep, and they certainly didn't, take them into market and try and sell them all. And it was like, well, why do you have all these sheep? They don't use them for wool. They very rarely eat one. What's their purpose? And then a farmer came up to me, well, no, we need the manure in order to grow our corn and our beans, which is which was here in this part of the world, corn and beans is the staple diet, the essence of diet, right? And so it's the idea of how to recycle waste from one part of the system into another part of the system. So, on a good small scale subsistence farm, you require almost zero inputs from the outside. The waste that is created, so animal waste, human waste, crop residues, etc., are recycled back into the long-term fertility of the soil. You produce an excedent or an excess amount of production, which can then be marketed locally. All of these are examples of circularity. So how can I would say that one of the challenges we have is how do we transform our economy to look more like the circular nature of regenerative farming, right? And so that showed that circularity does not have to be high tech. There are simple ways to mimic the natural world and build an economic system that, again, recognizes that exists within biophysical limits of the biosphere and designs appropriately, right? And nature always shows us examples of how we can do that, how waste can be reabsorbed and used by the system. I'm almost finished here. I don't know what time I don't have my clock on here, but I wanted to end real quick. There's a short video here in English about Scotland, a country in the UK, that's trying to make the move to a circular economy. So I'm going to turn this on here real quick and then turn up the volume.
We are currently living through a climate crisis, and if we do nothing, it will only get worse. But not if we act now. Here at Zero Waste Scotland, we're on a mission to help change our current way of living. To make more sustainable choices, use the things we need responsibly, share resources, and do better for our planet. Evidence estimates around 4/5 of Scotland's carbon footprint comes from the products and services we manufacture, use, and throw away. Material consumption and waste are the primary drivers of nearly every environmental problem we currently face, from water scarcity and flooding to habitat and species loss. To truly end our contribution to climate change, we need to rethink how we consume and make system-wide changes to help us do so. We know that a solution to this is moving from a linear economy, where we make, use, and dispose, to the circular economy, where everything has value and nothing goes to waste. Here is our friend Zero to help us explain this alternative and innovative economic model. From businesses to individuals, we can choose to design and use products with the intention of stretching the lifespan of that item. This way, things can stay in circulation for as long as possible, and we can maximise their value. Whether that's sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, or even recycling, instead of buying brand new and then throwing away. What would this mean for an everyday item, like a pair of jeans? Well, in a linear model, we would buy the jeans, wear them, and then throw them out when they're no longer in fashion or fit us. In a circular model, if the jeans ended up having a hole in them, we'd repair them. Over time, as they become more worn, we would maybe downgrade them from the smart pair we'd wear out to the ones we wear around the house. And then we would even repurpose the jeans into shorts and use the offcuts to repair other pairs of jeans. From a business perspective, we might not even own the jeans. We could lease them from the manufacturer who is responsible for their maintenance, so they might be repaired at regular intervals and that way last even longer. This could be jeans for life. Scotland is already making fantastic progress towards a circular economy, but we still have a way to go. Currently, it takes a lot of resources to produce and manufacture everyday products, which contributes massively to the carbon emissions that are overheating our planet. There are hidden carbon emissions in everything we buy, from mining, processing, packaging, transportation, especially of imported goods. With every purchase, we put pressure on our planet, making the Earth hotter and hotter. By embracing the circular economy, we can help save our planet, save us money, enhance our well-being, boost economies through job creation, and rebuild our sense of community. Living circular means making the most of what we've got and keeping things in use for as long as possible. There are businesses and individuals already adopting and seeing the benefit of living circular, many of which are across Scotland. Right on our doorsteps. By working together, we have a huge and vital opportunity to accelerate our circularity and to change Scotland and the world for the better.
Okay, that's the end of